Walter Merrick was 72 years old the morning he signed his name to a piece of paper that told him, in plain government language, that he owned almost nothing anymore. Not the shop. Not the house he and his wife had paid off 2 decades earlier. The one he'd quietly remortgaged the year Doreen got sick, when the bank offered a home equity loan against it because the shop's income alone couldn't cover what the treatments cost. Not the old boat he'd kept in the yard since 1994, sold that same year to a shrimper 2 towns over for $1,100, money that went straight into a single month of medication. Things had never gotten easier. They had gotten quieter instead, the way a house gets quiet after someone dies in it, and quieter still after the bank takes what's left. For 40 years, Merrick Marine Repair had sat 2 blocks off the harbor in Salt Run, North Carolina, a squat cinder-block building with a hand-painted sign and a bell over the door that Walter's late wife, Doreen, had hung there herself the week they opened in 1984, a decade after Walter came home from the Coast Guard and spent his 20s learning the trade in other men's boatyards up and down the coast. He had built engines back to life with parts other mechanics called scrap. He had fixed shrimp boats for men who paid him in fish because that was all they had. He had raised 2 children in the apartment above the shop before they moved out, moved on, moved away, first to Raleigh, then further, the way children do when a small coastal town stops having anything left to offer them. Then Doreen got sick. It took 2 years. Chemotherapy, then a clinical trial 2 hours from home that insurance covered halfway, then hospice, and by the end of it, Walter had taken out a second mortgage on the shop to go with the home equity loan on the house, borrowed against equipment he needed to keep working, and sold the boat and the good truck to pay for a month of medication that bought her 6 more weeks. She died on a Tuesday in October of 2023, in the front bedroom, harbor visible through the window if you leaned far enough to see it. Walter didn't cry that day. He cried 3 weeks later, alone in the shop, staring at an engine block he had no memory of pulling apart. The bank foreclosed on the shop the following spring, in 2024. 18 months earlier, Pamlico Trust had rolled the shop mortgage and the home equity loan into one consolidated note, with both properties pledged together as collateral. The only way the bank would keep extending credit while Walter was paying for treatment, instead of working full hours. When the shop's foreclosure sale didn't cover the balance, the bank came after the house too, and what little equity remained in either property went to satisfy what was owed. Not out of cruelty. Walter never once said the loan officer, a soft-spoken man named Elton Rooker at Pamlico Trust, had been anything but decent about it. Rooker had extended the note twice, waived 2 late fees, and finally sat across from Walter with a folder full of numbers that simply didn't work anymore. "I wish there was another way to say it," Rooker told him. "There isn't." Walter nodded like a man agreeing to a diagnosis he already suspected. He didn't argue. There was nothing to argue with. Arithmetic doesn't care how many boats you fixed or how many kids you fed on credit through a hard winter. By the time the auctioneer's sign went up on the shop door, Walter Merrick was already living out of a 5th-wheel trailer parked behind Coy Tillman's bait and tackle station, in exchange for sweeping the docks, hosing down the fish cleaning tables, and doing whatever engine work the charter captains needed done cheap. He was 72. He had a Coast Guard discharge from 1974, a set of hands that still knew machinery better than most men half his age, and, as far as he could tell at 5 in the morning listening to Rain Hit Tin, almost nothing else. If stories of second chances, hidden legacies, and quiet acts of courage mean something to you, like this video and subscribe to the channel. That summer, a few months into life behind the bait shop, it was Coy who first showed him the notice, printed off a government website and folded into quarters, the way Coy folded everything from receipts to love letters back when he still wrote them. "Federal auction," Coy said, sliding it across the counter between a bag of shrimp and a coffee can full of hooks. "GSA's dumping an old Coast Guard station out on the point past Drumneck. Been boarded up since I was a boy. This is the 4th time they've put it up. Minimum bid keeps dropping because nobody bites." Walter picked it up mostly to be polite. The General Services Administration handled the sale of surplus federal property, old post offices, decommissioned military buildings, lighthouses nobody wanted, and this listing was for a life-saving station turned Coast Guard outpost, deactivated in 1961, sitting on 11 acres of marsh-fringed point at the mouth of a shallow tidal cut the charts called Drum Neck Inlet. The photographs showed a 2-story clapboard structure with a collapsed porch, a boathouse leaning at an angle that looked one storm from lying down entirely, and a square lookout tower on the second floor, with its windows boarded from the inside. Buried in the listing, in the flat language of federal disclosure, was the reason the reserve price kept falling with every failed cycle. The property carried a recorded historic preservation covenant. Because the station was eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, any new owner would be bound by law to preserve its exterior character. No demolition, no major structural alteration, no tearing it down to build waterfront condos. For a builder, that covenant made the land worthless. For a man who only needed a roof that didn't move, it made the land the only thing in 3 counties he might actually afford. Minimum bid's $1,100 this round, Coy said. You believe that? Prettiest piece of nothing you ever saw going for less than my truck payment. Walter looked at the photograph of the lookout tower for a long moment. He thought about the trailer, about the smell of bait that had worked its way permanently into his clothes, about being 72 years old and owning, technically, a folding cot and a coffee maker. I believe it, he said. He drove out to Drum Neck 2 days before the auction closed, parked on the shoulder of a sand road that hadn't seen a grader in years, and walked the last quarter-mile on foot because the road simply stopped being a road. The station stood alone against gray water, gulls working the tide line, marsh grass grown up through what used to be a gravel drive. Up close, the boards over the windows were silvered with age, the paint long gone to bare wood, but the roofline was straight. The chimney stood. Whoever built it 100 years earlier had built it to survive weather that had, by every appearance, tried hard to take it down, and failed. Walter placed his hand flat against the clapboard siding the way he might rest a palm on the hood of an engine to feel whether it still had life in it. Nobody else bid. Walter's number came in at the minimum, $1,100, and then nothing happened for 6 weeks. Because being the high bidder on a GSA auction isn't the same as owning the property. The agency still had to decide the offer represented fair market value, and could have rejected it and relisted the station instead. It didn't. The reserve had already fallen twice on account of the covenant, and $1,100 for 11 undevelopable acres was close enough to the appraisal to accept. In September, a letter named Walter, the accepted purchaser, with 60 days to close. He drove to the county recorder's office in Ainsworth, the seat of Merrick County, that November, and signed the deed transfer in front of a clerk named Beatrice Hayne, who stamped the paperwork and told him, not unkindly, "Hope you know what you bought, hun." He didn't. Not yet. Here's something worth pausing on because it's true, and it's part of the reason a place like this can end up in the hands of a man with $1,100 and nothing left to lose. When the Coast Guard retires an old station, the building isn't simply boarded up and forgotten. It first has to be declared excess and screened for other federal use. Only if no agency claims it declared surplus, and even then it's screened again for programs like homeless assistance before ever reaching public sale. Only what's left after that reaches an auction like the one Coy found. Properties that fail to sell are often relisted at a reduced reserve price in later cycles, which is how a remote station can change hands for a fraction of its valuation. If historically significant, the sale can come with a preservation covenant recorded directly on the title, requiring any future owner to preserve the building's original character and blocking major renovation or demolition, often enough to scare off developers. There's a second piece of history folded into places like this. Keepers of the old U.S. Life-Saving Service, merged into the Coast Guard in 1915, were required to keep a daily station journal by hand. Weather, drills, every rescue logged in ink. Many of those logbooks survive today in federal archives. Walter didn't know any of that yet, standing on the porch with a crowbar in his hand. He only knew the roof didn't leak. Back to Walter's story. The prying loose of the boards took most of a Saturday. Walter worked alone, the way he'd worked most things alone since Doreen died, levering the crowbar under nail heads gone black with rust, stacking boards in a pile the wind kept trying to scatter. Inside, the station smelled like salt and dust and something underneath both, something like old paper. Most of the ground floor was as ruined as the photographs promised. Water-stained plaster, a collapsed section of ceiling, a rusted iron stove still bolted to the floor. But the second floor, reached by a staircase that groaned under his weight and held anyway, led to a narrow door at the end of the hall that had been sealed, not boarded from outside like the windows, but shut and latched from within. A heavy iron hook dropped into an eye bolt untouched in longer than Walter had been alive. It took him 20 minutes with a pry bar and a can of penetrating oil to get the hook loose. When the door swung inward, it opened onto the old watchroom at the top of the tower, windows still boarded, dust hanging thick enough to catch the beam of his flashlight like fog. There was a desk bolted to the wall beneath the windows, a wooden chair tipped on its side, and a shelf built into the wall itself, holding a row of cloth-bound ledgers gone soft and swollen with a century of sea air, and beside them, smaller, a single leather notebook with a name written on the inside cover in a cramped, careful hand. Amos Talbert, Keeper. Walter carried the ledgers down to the porch in armfuls, sat on the top step in the fading light, and began to read. The station logbooks were exactly what regulation required. Weather entered twice daily, drills logged by date, every rescue recorded with the names of vessels and men saved, going back in the earliest surviving volume to 1926. But it was Amos Talbert's personal notebook, tucked behind them, that Walter couldn't put down. The entries weren't official, weren't meant for any inspector's eye. They were the private accounting of a man running a station through the worst years the coast had ever seen. The winters of the Depression, when the fishing failed, the shipping dried up, and men without work started walking the coast roads looking for anywhere that might feed them. November 4th, 1932. 3 men came up from the Inlet Road tonight, dock hands from Wilmington, no work for 2 months. Walking north because a fellow told them there was cannery work in Norfolk that wasn't there. Fed them from the station stores and my own wages, which the regulations do not permit, and which I will not be recording in the official log. A man does not starve 12 feet from where I sleep because a form does not allow for it. March 1933. The Hollis boy came off a wrecked shrimper with nothing but the clothes on him. Kept him 11 days until his uncle could send for him. Told the district office it was a training exercise. It was not. The entries went on like that for years. Sailors pulled off wrecks with nowhere to go once they were dry, dock workers and drifters, and once, in the coldest entry Walter read, a whole family off a failing farm inland who'd walked to the coast because Amos Talbert's station had a reputation, passed mouth to mouth among men with nothing, as a place that wouldn't turn you away. Walter sat on that porch step until the light was gone, and read it twice more by flashlight. He thought about the trailer behind Coy's bait shop. He thought about being 72 years old with a folding cot and a coffee maker, and as of that afternoon, a 100-year-old building that a man named Amos Talbert had quietly turned into the only shelter some strangers ever got. He thought about the fact that he was, at this exact moment, closer to being one of those strangers than he had been at any point in his adult life. He didn't decide anything that night, but he didn't sleep in the trailer either. He laid a bedroll on the dry section of the station's second floor and stayed. Word travels fast in a town of scarcely 2,000 people, and it wasn't 2 weeks before a woman named Grace Odom knocked on the frame of the station's open front door, introducing herself as the volunteer archivist for the Marrow County Maritime Museum, a 2-room operation above the hardware store in Ainsworth that mostly ran on donated ship's wheel photographs and a grant that renewed itself every year by the skin of its teeth. Coy told me a Merrick bought the old Drumneck station, she said. I didn't believe him. Nobody's touched this place since I was in grade school. Walter showed her the ledgers. Grace Odom, a woman somewhere in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the unhurried patience of someone who'd spent 30 years coaxing information out of fragile paper, went very quiet, reading Amos Talbert's private notebook on the porch step where Walter had first read it. "You understand what you're holding," she said finally. "A logbook. You're holding the reason half the old families on this point are still here." She looked up at him. "My grandfather was a surfman down at Ocracoke Station, and I grew up hearing these stories. Keepers who fed men out of their own pocket during the Depression, and never told a soul because it wasn't in the regulations. Most of it's gone. Nobody wrote it down except the men themselves in books like this one, and most of those got thrown out or rotted in attics because nobody knew what they were looking at." She closed the notebook carefully, as if it might crumble. "This is a piece of history, Mr. Merrick. Real history. The kind that actually happened to actual people." Walter had come out to Drumneck Point looking for a roof. He left that conversation with something closer to a debt. It wasn't a single dramatic decision. It was smaller than that. The decision not to call the salvage company Coy had mentioned. The decision not to list the land with a realtor even after a man from a Wilmington firm called Renshaw Coastal Development left a card in his mailbox with a number that would have solved every problem Walter had. He kept the ledgers on the desk in the watchroom and started clearing debris instead of calling anyone to haul the building down. Somewhere in hauling out 60 years of collapsed plaster and dragging the rusted stove to the yard, Walter Merrick stopped thinking of Drumneck Station as a place he happened to own, and started thinking of it as a place he was, in some way he couldn't fully explain, responsible for. He fixed the roof first, patching where water had gotten in, because everything else depended on that. He fixed it with lumber bought on credit from a hardware store owner, Del Pruitt, who'd known Walter for 30 years, and extended him a running tab without being asked. He got the chimney swept, and the old wood stove reinstalled in the mess hall, scrubbed the watchroom down to bare wood, and oiled the desk where Amos Talbert had once sat writing entries he never intended anyone to read. Every step of it ran through Del Pruitt's contractor cousin, who pulled the proper permits at the county building office, because Harlan Voss, once Walter met him, made clear a paper trail would matter more than lumber before this was over. The community came the way tide comes in, and not all at once, but steadily, and then all at once. A man named Denny Yarrow showed up first, a lobsterman in his 50s with his grandfather's photograph tucked in a manila envelope, a black and white print of 6 surfmen standing in front of the station in oilskins, rescue boat behind them. "That's my grandfather," Denny said, pointing to a man on the end. "Cyrus Yarrow, served under Keeper Talbert near as I can tell, going by the dates. Family always said Cyrus talked about a keeper who'd give a man a bed even when the paperwork said not to. Never had a name to put to it till your friend up at the museum started asking around. More came after him. An old woman named Ottilie Rask brought a rescue medal that had belonged to her great-uncle, another surfman, and asked only that Walter let her leave it somewhere in the building where it belonged. Del Pruitt sent lumber. A church group from Ainsworth spent a Saturday hauling brush off the property for nothing but the sandwiches Walter made them for lunch. And a man named Harlan Voss came eventually, a retired preservation attorney who'd spent 30 years in Raleigh fighting exactly the kind of fights Walter didn't yet know he was about to be in. "Grace Odom sent me," Harlan said, standing in the yard with a cane he clearly didn't need but carried out of habit. "She says you've got yourself a genuine historic property, and no idea what that's worth or what it costs to protect. I've got a roof and a stack of old books," Walter said. "You've got a recorded preservation covenant on that deed, Mr. Merrick, and a documented historical record now in the county's file because of those ledgers. That covenant doesn't make you untouchable. If this building's ever genuinely unsafe, the county has every right to step in on safety grounds. But it does mean anyone trying to use a safety complaint to force you out has to go through the county's own process, an inspector's written finding, a notice, a hearing you can appeal. Not just show up with a folder of photographs and call it settled." Harlan looked past him at the fresh lumber patching the roof line. "Which is exactly why I want every repair documented and permitted, starting now. Because the day someone challenges this place, the paperwork will matter more than the building itself." It didn't take long for Walter to understand what he meant. By the following spring, nearly a year after the auction closed, Walter had opened the station's ground floor as what he called, when anyone asked, a resting place, a mess hall with cots and a working stove, open to whoever came up the inlet road with nowhere else to go. Fishermen between boats, a dock worker from the Ainsworth Co-op who'd been sleeping in his truck since a divorce took the house, a young Coast Guard veteran named Petty Bosworth who'd aged out of a shelter program in Wilmington and hitchhiked north because someone told him about a place on Drum Neck that didn't ask questions. He hadn't done it before he was ready. On Harlan's insistence, Walter had filed a change of occupancy request the moment the first fisherman asked to stay the night, and Del Pruitt's cousin fixed every fire and exit requirement the inspector flagged before a single cot came into the building. By early summer, the county had issued a temporary certificate of occupancy, good for 1 year, while a second exit sign and a fire extinguisher recertification worked toward final approval. It was provisional. It wasn't finished, but it was legal, and Harlan made sure the paperwork was on record before anyone came looking for a reason to shut it down. Walter fed the people who came out of a garden he'd put in behind the boathouse and money he still didn't have. The same arithmetic Amos Talbert had run 100 years before him, and for the first time since Doreen died, Walter Merrick woke up most mornings with something to do that wasn't just survival. That was when the letter came from Renshaw Coastal Development, citing a county inspection request Renshaw's own engineer had filed, and alleging structural violations, serious enough, the letter claimed, to trigger the county's unsafe building ordinance and force the station vacated. Covenant or no covenant. Cal Renshaw came out to the point himself 2 weeks later, a trim man in his 40s in a truck too clean for sand roads, carrying a folder of photographs Walter recognized as his own repairs, framed at angles that made the patched roofline look like a collapse in progress. "I'm not your enemy here, Mr. Merrick," Renshaw said, standing in the yard where Denny Yarrow's grandfather had once stood in oilskins. "There's a real safety question here, whether you want to hear it or not. That temporary paper covers a stove and a dozen cots. It doesn't mean this building's sound for the number of people sleeping here most nights. If my engineer's findings hold up and the inspector agrees this place is unsafe, he can order it vacated, and no covenant on that deed changes that." "It's not unlicensed," Walter said. "I've got a temporary certificate of occupancy from the county with my name on it, and a contractor's already fixed everything the first inspection flagged. You'd know that if you'd asked the county instead of just photographing my roof from a bad angle. Mr. Merrick, at your age, alone, running." "Talk to my attorney," Walter said. "You'll want to, before you say the word condemned again." The county building inspector, acting on Renshaw's complaint, came out within the week and issued a written finding under the county's unsafe building ordinance, along with notice of a hearing before his own office, set 10 days out. Harlan appeared with Walter at that hearing and laid out the temporary certificate on file. But the inspector issued a formal order. Correct the structural deficiencies Renshaw's engineer had flagged within 60 days, or the station's overnight use would be vacated, since nothing suggested the danger was immediate. Harlan filed a timely appeal to the county's Board of Commissioners within the 10 days allowed, the body with authority to affirm, modify, or revoke the order. Harlan met the appeal with an independent structural engineer who documented every repair Walter had made, through permits pulled properly by Del Pruitt's contractor cousin, the temporary certificate already on file, and a filing with the State Historic Preservation Office that put Amos Talbert's logbooks, verified and cross-referenced against Grace Odom's museum archive and the Coast Guard Historian's Office, into the official record as evidence of the station's historical significance. Denny Yarrow and Ottilie Rask both submitted sworn statements about their family's connection to the site. The hearing was held in the Merrick County Courthouse in Ainsworth on a Wednesday morning in early autumn of that same year, 2025, in a wood-paneled room that still had the flags and portraits it had probably had since the 1950s. Renshaw's attorney argued the inspector's findings justified the vacate order regardless of what had since been repaired. Harlan countered with the engineer's signed report, proof the structural deficiencies Renshaw's engineer had flagged were already corrected and permitted months earlier under Walter's original repairs, and finally laid Amos Talbert's century-old ledger on the table in front of the board, opened to the November 1932 entry, and read it aloud in a room silent enough that Walter could hear the clock on the wall. "A man does not starve 12 feet from where I sleep because a form does not allow for it," Harlan read, and let it sit a moment before he looked up. That is what stood on that point before Mr. Merrick ever bought it. That is what stands on it now, and it's being brought into full compliance on the record at Mr. Merrick's own initiative. Not because Mr. Renshaw's firm forced the issue, but because we started that process the day we understood what this building was being used for. I'd ask this board to weigh a documented, completed compliance effort against a set of photographs taken to make a patched roof look like a hazard. The board voted 3-2 to revoke the inspector's vacate order and uphold the temporary certificate, directing the county to issue Walter's final certificate once the 2 outstanding fire code items, the second exit sign and the extinguisher recertification, cleared a scheduled reinspection. A 90-day window, the engineer testified, was sufficient. Renshaw didn't come back out to the point after that. Walter heard later through Coy that the development firm had quietly moved its interest 3 miles down the coast to a parcel with no covenant standing in the way. Walter Merrick didn't get rich. He didn't get his shop back, or his old life, or Doreen, who he still talked to sometimes in the watchroom in the evenings. What he got, once the final occupancy certificate came through that winter, was a station full of cots that stayed occupied more nights than not, a garden that fed more than just him, and a town that had started calling the place, without anyone deciding it officially, the keeper's house. Not long after the hearing, a little more than a year after he'd pried the first board off that porch, Walter stood in the yard at Drum Neck Point on a clear evening with the tide coming in, watching Petty Bosworth teach a newly arrived dock worker how to mend a cast net, watching Grace Odom's museum interns photograph the ledgers for a permanent exhibit that would carry Amos Talbert's name for the first time in 90 years, watching lamplight come on in the mess hall window, the way it must have for 100 years before anyone alive today was born. He thought about the man who'd fed strangers out of his own wages and never once wrote his own generosity into the official record, because as far as Amos Talbert was concerned, it wasn't the kind of thing a man did for credit. Walter understood that now in a way he hadn't the first night he read those pages on the porch step. It wasn't really about the building or the covenant or even the history. It was about a door that stayed open for people who had nowhere else to knock. Walter Merrick had lost a wife, a business, a home, and nearly all of what he'd spent his life building. What he found waiting in a sealed room on Drum Neck Point wasn't a fortune, it was a reason. And nearly 100 years after Amos Talbert last latched that door, Walter finally finished what the old keeper started, leaving it open for whoever came up the road with nothing, and needed more than anything else, somewhere to be let in. If this story stayed with you, please like this video, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from or what part touched you most. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more stories of second chances, hidden truths, and new beginnings. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.